Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress by Dai C.G. Part 2, Chapter 11. Whenever anyone asks me what the town of Yongjing was like, I quote what my friend Wo had to say on the subject. So small that when the local canteen prepared a dish of beef and onions, the smell reached the nose of every single inhabitant. In fact, the town wasn't much more than a single high street about 200 meters long with a post office, town hall, general store, library, and school. There was also a restaurant attached to the hotel, which had a dozen rooms. At the far end of the town, halfway up a hill, was the district hospital. That summer, the headman of our village, sent us to town several times to watch films. I was convinced that the real reason behind his liberal attitude was the irresistible attraction of our alarm clock with its proud peacock-feathered rooster. Our ex-opium grower turned communist was besotted with it. The only way he could have it all to himself, even for a short time, was to dispatch us to Yongjing. During the 4 days it took us to get there, see the film, and return to our village, he would be lord and master of the clock. Towards the end of August, that is to say 1 month after our argument with Four Eyes and the ensuing breakdown in diplomatic relations, we set off for Yongjing again, but this time we were accompanied by the little seamstress. The basketball court turned open-air cinema was crammed with spectators. They were still showing the old North Korean film, The Little Flower Seller, which had moved the four sorceresses in the little seamstress's house to tears. It was a bad film, and seeing it a second time was not likely to change our opinion. But that didn't dampen our spirits. For one thing, we were glad to be in town again, even a town no bigger than a pocket handkerchief. Memories of city life came flooding back, and believe me, even the smell of beef and onions savored of sophistication. What's more, Yongjing had electricity instead of the oil lamps we were used to. I wouldn't go so far as to say that our visits to town had become an obsession, but at least having to trudge across the mountain to see a film meant getting 4 days off from laboring in the fields, from carrying human and animal dung on our backs, or from toiling in the paddy fields with water buffalo, whose long tails whacked you across the face. The other reason for our high spirits was that the little seamstress was with us. By the time we arrived, the film had already started, and there was only standing room left behind the screen, where everything was in reverse and everyone was left-handed. But the little seamstress didn't want to miss this rare treat. As for us, we were content to watch her lovely face bathed in the luminous colors bouncing off the screen. Now and then, everything would go dark, and her eyes would shine like spots of phosphorus in the gloom. Then suddenly, when the scene changed, her face would light up, flush with color and blossom with wonder. Of all the girls in the audience, and there were at least 2,000, she was certainly the prettiest. A sense of masculine pride stirred deep inside us, surrounded us, as we were by the jealous looks of the other men in the crowd. About halfway into the film, she turned to me and whispered in my ear. Her words pierced my heart. "It's so much better when it's you telling the story." The hotel we went to afterwards was very cheap, 5 pence for a room, barely the price of a portion of beef and onions. In the courtyard, we came upon the old bald-headed night watchman, whom we already knew, dozing on a chair. He pointed up at one of the windows where a light was shining and told us in a low voice that the room had been taken for the night by a woman traveling on her own. She was aged, about 40, he said, and had come from the provincial capital. She would be leaving for Phoenix Mountain in the morning. "It's her son she has come for," he added. "She has found him a good job in the city." "Her son's being re-educated?" Luo asked. "Yes, just like you." Who could this fortunate person be? The first of the 100-odd city youths on our mountain to be released from re-education. The question kept us awake at least half the night, feverish with envy. Our beds felt as if they were on fire. It was impossible to sleep in them. We had no idea who the lucky boy might be, although we went over and over the names of everyone we thought might be the candidate, excluding those of us who belonged in the 3 in 1,000 category because we were sons of Burgess parents, like Four Eyes, or sons of class enemies, like Luo and me. We were on our way home the next day when I happened to meet the woman who had come to rescue her son. Just before the footpath rose steeply among the rocks to lose itself in the white clouds shrouding the peaks, we caught sight of a vast slope dotted with Tibetan and Chinese tombs. The little seamstress wanted to show us where her maternal grandfather was buried. Not being partial to cemeteries myself, I stayed behind while she and Luo explored the forest and tombstones, some of which were half submerged in the ground, others covered in thick creeper. I settled down under an overhanging rock and, as usual, lit a fire with dry leaves and some branches, took a couple of sweet potatoes out of my bag, and was burying them among the embers when I looked up to see the woman sitting in a wooden chair lashed to the shoulders of a young man. What was really surprising was that in her none too steady seat, she displayed an almost superhuman serenity and was knitting, as though she were sitting on her balcony at home. A slight figure, she wore a dark green cord jacket, tan trousers, and a pair of flat-soled shoes made of soft greenish leather. When they drew abreast of me, her porter decided to have a rest and lowered the chair onto a flat-topped rock. The woman simply went on knitting, making no move to get down from her chair. She didn't even glance at what I was doing, nor did she exchange a single word with her porter. Using the local accent, I asked her if she had spent the night at the hotel in Yongjing. She nodded her head in confirmation and resumed her knitting. She was an elegant and undoubtedly rich woman who wasn't going to be taken aback by anything. I took a stick and speared a sweet potato from among the smoking embers, tapping it against a stone a few times to shake off the ash. I decided to switch to another accent. May I offer you a taste of mountain roast? You speak with a Jiangdu accent, she exclaimed. Her voice was gentle and melodic. I explained that Jiangdu was where my relatives lived, that it was my hometown. At this, she got out of her chair and, still holding her knitting, came over to sit by the fire, my fire. She was clearly not used to squatting down in such informal circumstances. She accepted my offer of the sweet potato with a smile and blew on it, but avoided taking a bite by asking what had brought me to this remote place. Was I being re-educated? Yes, on Phoenix Mountain, I replied, poking my stick into the ashes to find another sweet potato. Really? She cried. That's where my son is being re-educated. You may have met him. Seems he's the only one up there who wears glasses. The point of my stick glanced off the sweet potato, stabbing the ashes. My head swam as if I'd been struck in the face. Is your son Four Eyes? Yes, he is. So he's the first of us to be released? Oh, have you heard? Yes, indeed. He's going to work for a literary journal. Your son's an incredible expert on folk songs. I know. At first we were afraid he'd be wasting his time in the mountain, but we were mistaken. He's assembled a collection of splendid peasant songs, which he's adapted and modified. The editor-in-chief has shown great interest in the words. It's thanks to you that he was able to do his research. You gave him plenty of books to read. Of course. She lapsed into silence, then glared at me with suspicion. Books? Certainly not, she said coldly. Thank you much for the potato. She was truly perturbed. Seeing her discreetly replace her sweet potato among the embers, rise to her feet and make ready to continue her journey, I regretted having raised the subject of books. Suddenly she spun around and asked me the question I had been dreading. "What's your name? I'd like to be able to tell my son, whom I met on the way." "My name?" I echoed warily. "My name's Luo." Hardly had this lie escaped me when I was filled with remorse. I can still hear the emotion in that gentle, melodic voice of Four Eyes' mother cried out, "So you must be the son of the great dentist! What a surprise! Is it true what they say about your father treating Chairman Mao's teeth?" "Who told you that?" "My son told me, in one of his letters." "I didn't know." "Didn't your father tell you? How very modest of him. He is reputed to be a very great dentist. Very great. Actually, he's in detention at the moment. He's been classed as an enemy of the people." "So I've heard." "Four Eyes' father has been having similar problems." Her voice sank to a whisper. "But I shouldn't let it worry you too much. Right now, ignorance is in fashion. But one day the need for good doctors will be recognized once more. Besides, Chairman Mao is bound to need your father's services again. The next time I see my father, I'll certainly pass your sympathy to him. You shouldn't lose hope either. As for me, although I seem to be busy knitting this blue sweater, what I'm really doing is composing poems in my head while my hands are occupied." "How fascinating," I said. "What sort of poems are they, may I ask?" "This is confidential, dear boy." With the point of one of her knitting needles, she speared a sweet potato, which she skinned and then popped, piping hot, into her mouth. "My son likes you very much, did you know? He has mentioned you many times in his letters." "Really?" "Yes, but he's not so fond of your friend, it seems. The young man living in the same village as you." Quite a revelation. I congratulated myself on having assumed Luo's identity. "Why doesn't he like him?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "I think he's a bit sly. He suspects my son of having a suitcase hidden away, and every time he comes to visit, he's constantly looking for it." "A suitcase full of books?" "I wouldn't know," she said, suspicious again. "One day my son got so angry with a fellow that he punched him on the jaw and gave him a beating. I'm told he bled profusely." I spluttered with indignation and had to quell the urge to tell her that her son's vivid imagination was better suited to fiction than to faking folk songs. "I didn't know my son was so strong," she went on. "In my next letter, I warned him to stay out of trouble and never don't get involved in such a dangerous situation again. My friend will be very disappointed to hear that your son is leaving us for good." "Why? Did he want to get even?" "No, I don't think so. But he'll have to give up hope of ever laying hands on the secret suitcase." "Well, that's too bad, I'm sure." As her porter was beginning to show impatience, she bade me goodbye, wishing me luck. She settled herself in her chair, took up her knitting, and was gone. The tomb belonging to the little seamstress's ancestor was some distance from the main footpath. It stood on a facing corner of the slope among the graves of the poor. Some were little more than mounds of earth, of varying sizes. Others were in slightly better condition, their headstones sinking into the tall, wilting grass. The ancestor's grave was very modest, insignificant even. It was marked with a dark gray stone veined with blue, eroded by decades of harsh weather, and inscribed with just one name and two dates encapsulating on unremarkable life. Luo and the little seamstress laid down bunches of wild flowers they had picked nearby. redbud blooms with heart-shaped enameled leaves, cyclamens on elegantly curved stems, balsam flowers known locally as phoenix fairies, and also some rare wild orchids with immaculate milk white petals set around a heart of the softest yellow. "Why the long face?" the little seamstress called out to me. "I'm grieving for Balzac," I shouted back. I went down the slope to join them and told them about my encounter with Four Eyes' mother, the knitting poetess. They didn't seem to share my indignation at the scandalous theft of the old miller's songs, nor were they unduly affected by the news that Four Eyes would be leaving the mountain, nor indeed by the prospect of losing Balzac. But they were greatly amused when I told them I had pretended to be Luo, the dentist's son, and their laughter filled the silence of the graveyard. Once again, I watched the little seamstress's face with fascination. She was breathtaking as she had been the night before at the open-air cinema. But now that she was laughing, I was so utterly captivated that I wanted to marry her there and then, regardless of her being Luo's girlfriend. In her peals of laughter, I caught the musky fragrance of wild orchids, stronger than the scent of the flowers lying at her feet. Luo and I remained standing while she knelt by her grandfather's grave. She prostrated herself several times, speaking soothing words to him in a kind of murmured monologue. Suddenly she swung her head round to face us. "About those books of his, what if we stole them?"